Hey everyone, welcome back to True Crime Echoes. I'm really glad you're here. Today's story is different, not because it's more violent or more twisted than others, but because it forces us to look at something we often take for granted belief. For decades, Ed and Lorraine Warren were considered America's most famous paranormal investigators. Their names are attached to some of the most iconic horror stories of all time: The Conjuring, Annabelle, the Amityville Horror. You've seen the movies, read the books, heard the legends. But what if behind those ghost stories was something much darker? What if the real horror wasn't in the haunted houses, but in the people who walked through them, recording, collecting, and selling fear to the masses? This episode isn't just about demons or dolls, it's about power, about image, about the fine line between helping people and manipulating them. It's about what happens when we stop asking questions simply because someone sounds like they know what they're talking about. So, whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, I invite you to sit with me in the uncomfortable space between truth and illusion. Because today, we're not just revisiting the most chilling cases of the Warrens' career, we're asking what those cases say about them and what they say about us. This is the story of Ed and Lorraine Warren. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The Curiosity That Started It All. You know, I wasn't planning to fall down a rabbit hole that weekend. It all started pretty simply. The air was just starting to get crisp, and even though it technically wasn't fall yet, I was already in that Halloween headspace. You know what I mean? Pumpkins, cobwebs, scary movie marathons. That kind of vibe. So I thought, why not start early this year? I put out a few decorations, nothing too dramatic. Just a couple of pumpkins, some stringy spider webs, and those plastic crows that always make my dog bark. And then I sat down to binge something spooky. That's when I saw the latest Conjuring movie pop up on my recommended list. I was like, oh right, Ed and Lorraine Warren again. You've probably heard of them. The husband and wife demonologist duo who inspired half the horror movies we've all seen over the last decade. I've watched the Conjuring films, Annabelle the Nun, all of it. And somehow, I never really questioned whether Ed and Lorraine were, well, real. That night, I paused the movie halfway through, picked up my laptop, and typed their names into Google. I just wanted to know if they were a real couple or just characters. But what I found, I couldn't stop reading. There were interviews, documentaries, skeptics, supporters. It was a mess: contradictions, lawsuits, paranormal cases that were either terrifying or completely debunked. And at the center of it all were Ed and Lorraine, painted as heroes by some and total frauds by others. That's when it hit me. What's the real story behind Ed and Lorraine Warren? Were they truly gifted demonologists, sent to help families in crisis, or were they brilliant storytellers who knew how to sell fear to the masses? And more importantly, how much of what we believe about these so-called hauntings actually happened? The deeper I looked, the more questions I had. Their rise to fame wasn't just about ghosts. It was about timing, tragedy, charisma, and maybe even exploitation. So today we're going to explore their lives, their most famous cases, and the dark controversies that followed them until the very end. And by the time we're done, maybe you'll have your own answer to the question I started with. Were Ed and Lorraine Warren the real deal? Or were they just really good at making us believe they were? Let's begin. Chapter 2: Haunted from the Start. When you hear about people becoming famous for chasing ghosts, you kind of expect them to have a strange origin story. And with Ed and Lorraine Warren, that's exactly what you get. Let's start with Ed. He was born in 1926 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And from a really young age, like 5 years old, he claimed to have seen things other people couldn't. According to his biography, the demonologist Ed grew up in what he said was a haunted house. He talked about seeing shadowy figures, hearing whispers, and having dreams where dead relatives, ones he had never even met, would visit him. Now I know that sounds like something out of a horror novel. But what's interesting is that Ed didn't shy away from these experiences. He leaned into them, and that's a pattern you're going to see a lot. As we talk about his life, he always had this sense of certainty. He knew what he saw, and he made other people believe it too. Then there's Lorraine. She was born just a year after Ed, also in Bridgeport, and her story is just as eerie. Lorraine said that she began seeing auras around people when she was young, like colors glowing around their bodies. She believed she could predict events before they happened. For her, these weren't visions or hallucinations, they were just part of life, part of who she was. So we've got two kids, both from the same town, both claiming to experience the supernatural in ways most people don't. It almost feels like fate that they met. And they did in 1944 at a theater in Bridgeport. Ed was working as an usher. Lorraine had come to watch a movie. They locked eyes, talked, and that was it. Instant connection. Romance in the middle of World War II. But Ed didn't stick around for long. At just 17, he enlisted in the Marines. The thing is, he lied about his age, and he got kicked out once they found out. But he didn't give up. He managed to enlist again, this time in the Navy. That's when something wild happened. Just 4 months into his deployment, Ed's ship was hit by an oil tanker and caught fire. He barely made it out alive. That accident earned him something called survivor's leave, a short trip back home. And the first thing he did when he got back, he proposed to Lorraine. They got married right away. And after the war, they settled down into what looked like a pretty typical suburban life. They had a daughter named Judy. Ed went to art school, and Lorraine supported the household. But this is where things take a turn. A normal life just didn't seem to work for Ed. He wasn't interested in factory work or business suits. What he was interested in was painting haunted houses. Yeah, haunted houses. Ed discovered that he had a gift, not just with a paintbrush, but with capturing the darker energy of old, crumbling buildings. He would find these eerie-looking homes, sit outside on a folding chair, and paint his own vision of what he believed the house really looked like, what it felt like. But painting creepy houses isn't exactly a lucrative career. And so the Warrens came up with a plan. They started scanning local newspapers for stories about hauntings. If they found a house with a ghost story, Ed would paint it, knock on the homeowner's door, and say something like, "Hey, I painted your house, want to see it?" And once they were inside, that's when the so-called investigation would begin. Ed would introduce himself as a demonologist. Not a priest, not a psychic, a demonologist. Which sounds super official, except it wasn't. There was no formal training, no seminary degree. Ed just decided he was one, and honestly, he said it with such confidence people believed him. Lorraine, on the other hand, positioned herself as the clairvoyant. She'd sit on the furniture, touch the walls, close her eyes. She'd say she could sense spirits, raid energies, sometimes even communicate with the dead. To be fair, many of the people they visited claimed they felt better afterward. Some felt relieved. Others said they finally had an explanation for what was going on. And whether or not it was real, that comfort was real enough for them. Over time, the Warrens got good, really good at what they did. Their names started to circulate. They were no longer just two eccentric believers, they were becoming known as legitimate paranormal investigators. They never charged for the investigations. That part was always free. But what they did do was claim the rights to the stories. They sold those stories to journalists, television shows, even screenwriters. And then they opened their infamous occult museum, filled with cursed objects, videotapes, photos, and case files. The haunted doll, the possessed mirrors, the spirit boards, all of it was on display. All of it told a story. Their story. From the outside, it looked like a couple devoting their lives to fighting evil. But from the inside, it was a carefully crafted narrative, one that made them famous. And eventually infamous. And this is where it starts to get messy. Because their first really big case, the one that made national headlines, didn't involve demons at first. It involved a doll. A doll named Annabelle. And that's where we're going next. Chapter 3, The Doll That Wasn't Just a Doll. I've always believed there's something inherently unsettling about dolls. Maybe it's the way they mimic life but never quite feel alive. The way their eyes never blink, yet somehow still manage to follow you across a room. And if there's one doll that's become the poster child for every haunted object out there, it's Annabelle. Now, most people only know Annabelle from the movies. You know, the porcelain doll with the cracked face and the creepy Victorian dress. But the real Annabelle looked nothing like that. She was soft, stuffed, and wide-eyed. A Raggedy Ann doll, the kind that used to sit on shelves in little girls' bedrooms. She looked harmless, innocent even. But according to the Warrens, she was anything but. It started in 1970. A nursing student named Donna received the doll from her grandmother as a graduation gift. Just a sweet gesture, something sentimental. Donna lived in an apartment with her roommate Angie, and at first the doll was just a quirky little decoration sitting on her bed. But then, weird things started happening. It was subtle at first. Donna would leave the doll on her bed in the morning, only to come home and find it on the couch. Or it would be slumped over one way, and then found sitting upright the next. Small things, things you could easily explain away. Maybe we bumped it. Maybe we forgot where we left it. But then the movements got bolder. Donna came home one day to find the doll in her bedroom again. But this time the door was shut, and no one had been home. That's when they started finding handwritten notes on parchment paper, things like, "Help me" or "Help Lou." The only problem, no one in the apartment owned parchment paper, or a fountain pen, and no one admitted to writing them. Now Lou, he was Angie's friend, and he hated the doll from the beginning. He said it gave him a bad feeling. Every time he walked into the room, he swore it was watching him. He started having nightmares, and then one night, while sleeping alone in his own apartment, he woke up to find the doll sitting on his chest, choking him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. Just that overwhelming pressure on his throat and the wide, painted eyes of the doll staring straight into his. And even after he woke up, the sensation lingered. It felt real. Eventually, Donna decided enough was enough. She called a medium to come in and conduct a seance. That's when things got even more bizarre. According to the medium, the doll wasn't possessed in the traditional sense. It was being manipulated, controlled by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins. Supposedly, Annabelle had died tragically in the same area years before and had latched onto the doll because she felt safe with Donna and Angie. She didn't want to hurt anyone, the medium said. She just wanted to stay. And for a moment that explanation brought comfort. Maybe this wasn't something evil. Maybe it was just a lost soul looking for companionship. But then Lou got attacked again. This time it wasn't a dream. He was in the apartment helping the girls pack for a trip when he felt something strange, like a sharp pain in his chest. He fell to the ground. When he looked down, he saw claw marks, deep, bloody scratches across his torso. No one saw what happened. No one could explain it. That's when the Warrens got involved. Ed and Lorraine came to the apartment, listened to the stories, and quickly came to a very different conclusion. According to them, this wasn't some sweet, harmless little girl spirit. This was a demon. A manipulative entity using the doll as a vessel to get close to the humans it wanted to possess, specifically Donna. Ed explained that the situation was in what he called the infestation stage. The demon hadn't possessed Donna yet, but it was getting close. And if they didn't act soon, the next stage would be oppression, followed by full possession. They contacted a priest who came in to bless the apartment and perform an exorcism. After that, the disturbances stopped, at least for Donna and Angie. But the doll, the Warrens, took it with them. Ed claimed he didn't want anyone else getting hurt, so they put Annabelle in the backseat of their car and drove her home. But even that drive wasn't easy. They said the car stalled multiple times, and at one point the brakes failed altogether. It wasn't until Ed sprinkled holy water on the doll that things calmed down. Back at their house, the Warrens built a special case for Annabelle, lined with glass, blessed sealed shut. And they placed a sign on it, warning, positively do not open. It now sits in their occult museum surrounded by other allegedly cursed objects. Over the years, people have questioned the story. Some say it was a hoax exaggerated for publicity. Others believe it completely. There's one story that gets repeated a lot. A young man visited the museum with his girlfriend. He banged on the glass of Annabelle's case, mocked her, challenged her to do something. On their way home, they got into a motorcycle accident. He died instantly. His girlfriend survived and later told people that they'd been joking about the doll right before the crash. Coincidence, maybe. But that's the thing with stories like this. Once a narrative like Annabelle's enters public consciousness, it's hard to separate the myth from the truth. The facts become blurry. And all that's left is how it made you feel. Scared, curious, suspicious. And whether you believe the Warrens or not, there's no denying this case put them on the map. After Annabelle, they weren't just local ghost hunters. They were America's go-to experts on the paranormal. And their next case, it would take them from haunted dolls to a house soaked in blood, the Amityville Horror. That's coming next. Chapter 4. Amityville. Truth, terror, and a house that wouldn't stay quiet. Some houses are just houses, brickwood drywall, nothing more than a place to sleep at night. But then there are those houses where something feels off. You step through the front door and feel like you're not alone even when you are. That's what the Lutz family said about 112 Ocean Avenue, and it didn't take long for the rest of the world to believe them. By the time Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at the Amityville house, their names were already becoming well known in paranormal circles. But this case, this was the one that changed everything. It took them from those ghost people to something bigger, something mainstream. And it all started with a brutal murder. Let's rewind to 1974. Amityville is this quiet little town on Long Island, New York. And on the night of November 13th, something horrific happened. A man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. walked into a local bar, pale and shaking, and told people his parents had been shot. Police followed him home, and what they found still chills me. Inside the house were the bodies of Ronald's entire family, his father, mother, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters. All shot execution style while lying in their beds. The rifle had been fired without a single neighbor reporting gunshots. No one woke up. No one screamed. It was like the entire house was frozen in time. At first, Ronald claimed a mob hitman was behind it, but within a day he confessed. He had drugged his family with sleeping pills at dinner, then killed them one by one. When asked why, his answer was chilling. The voices told me to. That alone would have been enough to haunt the town forever. But then came the Lutz family. A year after the murders, George and Kathy Lutz bought the house for a bargain, just $80,000. I get it. Big house, beautiful neighborhood, tragic past. But they believed they could start fresh. They moved in with their 3 kids, ready to make it a home. They lasted 28 days. From the very first night, they felt something was wrong. George said he was constantly cold, no matter how much he fed the fire. He stopped eating, stopped showering. He became obsessed with the fireplace, like something was pulling him to it. Kathy had dreams of murder. She said she woke up to find herself levitating above the bed. Their daughter Missy made an imaginary friend one with glowing red eyes named Jody. Doors slammed. Black sludge oozed from the walls. Clocks stopped at exactly 3:15 a.m., the time the murders were believed to have occurred. And then there was the smell. They said it reeked of death. It clung to the air no matter how many times they cleaned. The toilets stained black. Crucifixes on the walls turned upside down. And the worst part, they all began to change. Their moods, their behavior, like the house was getting inside of them. Desperate, the Lutzes called a priest to bless the house. But when he entered one particular room, he claimed he heard a deep, guttural voice growl, "Get out." He didn't need to be told twice. He left immediately and later warned the family to avoid that room altogether. Eventually, they couldn't take it anymore. In the dead of night, they packed what little they could and fled, leaving behind furniture, clothes, even personal items. They told no one for weeks, but when their story got out, it exploded. Reporters swarmed the house. Paranormal investigators came from all over, and then came Ed and Lorraine Warren. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The Warrens entered the Amityville house in 1976. Lorraine later said she immediately felt an oppressive force, something that wanted her gone. She claimed she could see the murdered DeFeo family lying in the living room, their bodies covered with white sheets soaked in blood. Ed reported feeling sudden cold spots and hearing unexplained noises. They brought in psychics, took infrared photographs, recorded hours of audio. One of the most famous images they captured was of a young boy peeking out from behind a doorway upstairs. His eyes were glowing. No children had been present during the shoot. That photo was published everywhere. The Warrens declared the house was plagued by a demonic presence. Not just the restless spirits of the murdered family, but something much older, much darker. They claimed the house had been built on land, cursed by Native American tribes, and that a man who practiced black magic had once lived there. They said it was a magnet for evil, and the world believed them. The media frenzy was immediate. Books were written, interviews aired. In 1977, the Amityville Horror by Jay Anson hit shelves and became a bestseller. Just 2 years later, it was turned into a movie. The Lutzes reportedly made over $300,000 from their story. And the Warrens, they were now famous. But the thing is, fame has a way of turning believers into skeptics. Almost immediately, questions began to surface. Neighbors claimed they never saw or heard anything strange. No police reports. No witnesses. The priest who was supposedly attacked later said he'd never even visited the house. The glowing-eyed boy in the photo. Some people said it was just a photographer's assistant caught mid-step, distorted by a long exposure. And then came the real bombshell. In 1988, Ronald DeFeo's former attorney William Weber admitted that he had helped the Lutz family create the haunting story. He claimed they sat around drinking wine and brainstorming spooky details to add like the slime on the walls and the demonic voices. His motive, money. He hoped the media attention would support DeFeo's insanity defense. That didn't work, by the way. DeFeo was convicted and sentenced to 6 life sentences. But the damage was done. Even with these revelations, the legend of Amityville only grew. More books, more movies, more believers. And somehow the Warrens stayed right at the center of it all, rarely questioned, rarely challenged. And I have to be honest, this is where my feelings about them start to shift. Because if the Warrens truly believed what they were saying, then maybe they were just victims of their own convictions. But if they knew it was a hoax, if they went along with it for fame and money, that changes everything. That makes them not just storytellers, but exploiters. Exploiters of tragedy, of fear, of people looking for answers. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain: Amityville cemented Ed and Lorraine Warren as household names. It gave birth to a paranormal empire, and it blurred the line between folklore and fact in a way few stories ever have. But their rise to fame wouldn't come without consequences. Because their next case, on a different continent, in a quiet home in England, would start to crack their carefully crafted image. And for the first time, people started calling them frauds. We'll go there next. Chapter 5. The Enfield Poltergeist. Cracks in the Legacy. There's a moment in every legacy where the shine starts to wear off, where the questions get louder than the applause. And for Ed and Lorraine Warren, that moment didn't happen in America. It happened across the Atlantic on a quiet street in North London in a council house that became one of the most heavily documented hauntings of the 20th century. This is the story of the Enfield Poltergeist. It started in 1977 in a modest home in the Enfield district of London. A single mother named Peggy Hodgson lived there with her 4 children. Life wasn't easy, money was tight, and the kids were growing up fast. But what happened next wasn't just hard, it was inexplicable. According to the family, it began with strange knocking sounds. At first they thought it was the neighbors or plumbing issues, but then furniture started moving. Chairs tipped over on their own. A chest of drawers slid across the room and blocked the bedroom door. And it didn't just happen once, it happened again. And again. 2 of the daughters, Janet and Margaret, seemed to be the focus. Most of the activity centered around them, especially Janet, who was only 11 at the time. She claimed to be pushed, grabbed, even levitated. There were reports of disembodied voices, loud bangs, toys flying through the air. And here's the thing, multiple witnesses said they saw it all. The local police were called. Not just once, multiple times. And according to their reports, they also witnessed furniture moving on its own. One officer even signed an affidavit saying she saw a chair slide across the floor unaided, and when the police couldn't explain it, the press got involved. Soon reporters and photographers from the Daily Mirror were camped outside the house. One photographer was actually hit in the face with a flying Lego brick while sitting in the living room. That image, grown men ducking from airborne Legos, is ridiculous, I know. But to them it was terrifying. This wasn't fun and games. It felt dangerous. So then came the investigators. One in particular, Maurice Grosse, spent months with the Hodgson family. He lived in the house, documented hours of recordings, and personally witnessed what he believed was poltergeist activity. But what really grabbed people's attention was Janet's voice. She claimed she was being possessed by a man named Bill Wilkins, who had died in the house years earlier. And when she spoke as Bill, her voice dropped into this deep, growling tone, something you wouldn't expect from a preteen girl. Recordings of her voice were played on British television. The public was divided. Some believed it. Others said she was faking it. And then, of course, the Warrens showed up. Now, here's the thing. They weren't invited. They just showed up. According to Maurice Grosse, Ed and Lorraine arrived unannounced, and Ed immediately started talking about turning the case into a media opportunity. Maurice later said Ed told him they could make a lot of money from the case. That rubbed him the wrong way. It wasn't about helping the family. It was about headlines. So the Warrens were asked to leave. They spent less than 24 hours in the house. But in later interviews, they spoke about Enfield as if they had investigated it fully, as if it were their case. Just like Amityville, they inserted themselves into the narrative, only this time people noticed. Other investigators, even those who believed the Hodgsons were experiencing something supernatural, were quick to point out that the Warrens had almost no involvement. And that's when critics started connecting the dots. Were Ed and Lorraine really helping people? Or were they chasing fame? It didn't help that years later, Janet herself admitted that she and her sister had faked some of the activity. She said the media pressure was intense and they were just kids trying to deal with something they didn't understand. But she insisted that not everything was fake. Some of it, she claimed, was very real. So what do we do with that, a partially true haunting? A family half believed, half doubted by the world? To me, this case feels like a turning point, not just for the Warrens, but for the way we think about the paranormal. Before this, ghost stories were largely accepted or dismissed based on belief. But with Enfield, the public started asking harder questions, looking for inconsistencies, fact-checking timelines. They didn't just want to be scared, they wanted evidence. And the Warrens. They were starting to look less like saviors and more like opportunists. Still, the Enfield case has its believers. The recordings exist. The photos exist. And maybe something did happen in that little house in North London. Maybe something attached itself to Janet. Maybe trauma manifested in ways we still don't fully understand. Or maybe it was all just a story that got out of control. What we do know is that for Ed and Lorraine, the shine was starting to fade. Their name no longer carried the same weight it once did. And behind the scenes, whispers were growing louder. Whispers that said they were fabricating evidence, that they were exaggerating, that they were hiding something far more disturbing than any ghost. And soon, those whispers would become headlines, because if you thought haunted dolls and cursed houses were dark, just wait until you see what was happening inside the Warren household itself. That's next. Chapter 6. Breaking the Illusion. The Amityville Hoax Exposed. There's a certain point in every story where the audience starts to wonder, wait, how much of this is actually true? For Ed and Lorraine Warren, that moment came after Amityville. The Amityville horror was their golden ticket. It launched them into the mainstream, opened doors to books, film adaptations, talk shows. It made them, in a way, celebrities, and for a long time, nobody really questioned it. I mean, why would you? The murders were real. The house was real. The Lutz family was real. It all seemed legit. But over time, pieces of the story started to fall apart. It started slowly, little cracks here and there. Critics raised questions. Investigators noticed inconsistencies. But the real unraveling didn't come from skeptics. It came from someone who was there from the very beginning. In 1988, more than a decade after the Lutz family fled the house in terror, Ronald DeFeo's former attorney William Weber made a confession, one that would flip the entire Amityville narrative on its head. He admitted that he had collaborated with the Lutzes to invent much of the haunting, and not just exaggerated it, they planned it. According to Weber, they all sat down together, him, George, and Kathy Lutz, and Jay Anson, who later wrote the best-selling book, and basically workshopped the haunting over wine. They took ordinary occurrences in the house and turned them into supernatural events. a plate of spilled spaghetti that became the infamous green slime oozing from the walls, drafty windows. Suddenly, it was demonic chills, Kathy's nightmares. Great, let's throw in levitation and glowing red eyes. Weber said the goal was clear from the start: money. He believed that if they could build up enough public fascination around the house, it would not only help sell a story but also assist his client, Ronald DeFeo, in claiming an insanity defense. The implication was chilling. This entire supernatural saga may have been constructed not from terror, but from legal strategy. Now hearing that made me pause. Because if that's true, and there's a lot pointing to the fact that it is, then everything the Warrens claimed they witnessed in that house becomes questionable. And the part that really gets under my skin, they kept the act going. Long after others began to distance themselves from the story, the Warrens continued to tell it. They gave lectures. They showed that now infamous photo of the ghost boy on the stairs. They sold it as proof. But even that photograph, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence from the Amityville case, has been challenged. Some believe it wasn't a ghost at all. They say it was just a man, possibly a member of the investigation team, captured at the wrong angle with strange lighting. There's no way to confirm it either way, but it raises a bigger question. If you're already lying about the context, how can we trust the content? And then came the claim about Native American spirits. Ed Warren told reporters that the Amityville house had been built on sacred Shinnecock land, and that it had once served as a sort of prison camp for mentally ill members of the tribe. According to Ed, their spirits still roamed the property, angry and unsettled. But guess what? The Shinnecock Nation themselves reached out to the press to say, that's completely made up. There were no historical records of any burial sites or sacred grounds in that area. Nothing. The Warrens had fabricated the entire spiritual backstory. So again, I had to ask myself, was this ignorance or was it manipulation? And the more I dug, the more disturbing it got. Even the Lutz children, specifically Christopher, one of the sons, spoke out years later saying he believed his father had essentially orchestrated everything. He called his dad a professional showman and said he felt exploited by the entire experience. That word exploited kept echoing in my mind. Because if we strip away the ghosts and the demons, what's left is a group of people vulnerable, grieving, searching for stability, being used to sell books and fill lecture halls. And maybe that's the real horror. There's something deeply unsettling about watching a story like this fall apart. Because the Warrens had built their entire career on credibility. They told us they were different. They weren't in it for money. They were doing God's work. They were saving people from evil. But this case, this one that made them famous, seems to be built on fiction profit and public gullibility. Now look, I'm not here to say that nothing paranormal ever happened in that house. I wasn't there. I don't know what the Lutz family experienced in private. Maybe there were real moments of fear. Maybe they truly believed something was out to get them. But once you start building a brand on those fears, once you start making money off of them, it becomes really hard to tell the difference between belief and business. And maybe that's what makes this case such a turning point. Because after Amityville, people didn't just question the Warrens, they started to doubt them. Hardcore. And once that seed of doubt was planted, it was hard to unsee all the contradictions, all the patterns, all the signs that maybe these so-called paranormal warriors were more interested in media contracts than malevolent spirits. But as we'll see in the next chapter, the questions didn't stop with Amityville. Because while the public was still debating haunted houses and cursed dolls, a much darker, more personal secret was quietly growing behind closed doors. And it wasn't about demons. It was about Ed Warren himself. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Shadows. The Scandal Behind the Warrens. It's one thing to question someone's work. It's another thing entirely to question their character. Up to this point, everything about Ed and Lorraine Warren had been surrounded by controversy, yes, but mostly around their cases. Were the hauntings real? Were they exaggerating? Was it for fame or for faith? But in 2017, long after Ed had passed and Lorraine was in the final years of her life, a woman came forward, not with a ghost story, but with something far more disturbing. Something real, tangible. something that couldn't be explained away with demonic energy or psychic visions. Her name was Judith Penny. If you've ever seen photos of the Warrens in their later years, at lectures at their museum in the background of interviews, there's a chance you've seen Judith and not even realized it. For decades, she was just the assistant, the quiet woman who helped run their occult museum. But according to Judith, her role was far more complicated and far more troubling. She claimed that she had been involved in a secret relationship with Ed Warren starting when she was only 15 years old. 15. According to Judith, Ed had met her while he was working as a delivery driver, and she was still a high school student. One thing led to another, and eventually she moved into an apartment above the Warrens' house. She lived there for years, not as an employee, not as a boarder, but as Ed's girlfriend. Lorraine knew. Judith said that openly. It wasn't a secret between Ed and Judith. It was something Lorraine allegedly tolerated, as long as it didn't interfere with their public image. Because that was what mattered: the reputation, the ministry, the business. In 1963, Judith was even arrested, not Ed Judith. Apparently, under Connecticut law at the time, it was illegal for an unmarried minor to cohabit with a married adult. The police caught wind of the relationship, and instead of holding Ed accountable, they arrested her. She was a child. And they put the burden on her. She spent a night in jail and was later forced to report to a delinquent youth program. And who picked her up from those mandated sessions, Ed. He was 37 years old, married, a father, and picking up the teenage girl he was secretly living with. Let that sit with you for a moment. According to Judith, the arrangement continued for years. She was with them for nearly 4 decades. She said Ed would alternate nights, sometimes with Lorraine, sometimes with her. It was like living inside a secret that no one was supposed to acknowledge. A shadow existence built on silence and control. But the worst part, in 1978, at the height of the Warrens' fame post-Amityville, post-books, post-late-night talk show appearances, Judith became pregnant. And that's when, according to her, things turned cold. Judith says that Lorraine panicked. A child would ruin everything. It would tear apart the story. It would raise too many questions. So she says Lorraine forced her to have an abortion. Not just pressured forced. Judith was told to lie and say she had been raped by a stranger. But she refused. In the end, she went through with the abortion, and she said it broke her. She never told anyone publicly until decades later, long after Ed had died, and Lorraine was no longer giving interviews. But when she finally spoke up, the story hit hard. Because for years, Ed and Lorraine had been presented to the public as a godly couple, Catholic, devoted, rescuers of souls. And now there was this woman, soft-spoken, consistent, and painfully human, telling the world that the real evil wasn't just in haunted houses. It was upstairs, in the apartment above the Warrens' own home. When asked why she kept quiet for so long, Judith said she was scared. Scared of ruining their image. Scared of the backlash. And honestly, I don't blame her. It's not easy to speak out against beloved figures, especially when those figures are shrouded in faith, charisma, and media protection. And yes, these are allegations. But here's something I found really telling. When Warner Brothers secured the rights to make the Conjuring films, Lorraine included very specific language in the contract. The filmmakers were prohibited from depicting her or Ed engaging in any crimes, including sexual relationships with minors, extramarital affairs, or anything that would tarnish their moral image. Now, I've looked at a lot of film contracts in my time, and that kind of clause. That's not normal. You don't usually have to put something like that in writing, unless you're worried someone might bring it up. And that's when I realized something. The Warrens didn't just build a career. They built a myth. A carefully controlled, tightly guarded myth. They were the fearless demonologists who stood between good and evil. The married couple who devoted their lives to helping others. They were never just ghost hunters. They were a brand. And protecting that brand seemed to come at any cost. When I think about Judith, I don't see someone trying to destroy legacies. I see someone who lived in silence for years, finally stepping out of the shadows. And in a way, her story is scarier than any haunted house. Because it's not about spirits or possession or ancient curses. It's about power, about image, about the very human ability to convince others we are something we're not. And for me, that's where the real darkness lives, in what we hide behind and what we're willing to ignore just because someone tells a good story. Chapter 8: Legacy or Illusion: What We Choose to Believe. I think one of the hardest truths to sit with is this: sometimes the people who tell us the most captivating stories are the ones hiding the darkest ones of their own. For decades, Ed and Lorraine Warren built something bigger than themselves. They weren't just demonologists. They were guardians of a worldview, one where evil was real, where houses could be haunted, where faith could cast out darkness. They offered people certainty at a time when the world felt increasingly uncertain, and people clung to it. I understand why. I really do. There's something comforting about the idea that every bad thing can be explained. That there's always a reason, even if that reason is a demon in the basement or a cursed doll on the shelf. It's easier than accepting that sometimes the scariest things in life are just people, decisions, secrets. The Warrens gave us monsters we could point at. But what happens when the monsters were never in the houses they investigated, but in the stories they told? I'll be honest, when I started digging into their past, I wasn't expecting to feel disappointed. Disillusioned, maybe. But what surprised me most was how much grief I felt, because I used to believe them. Not in every detail, sure, but in their intentions. I believed that they were trying to help people. But now I don't know. There's too much that doesn't add up. Too many convenient twists, too many contradictions between what they said publicly and what was happening privately. And once you see the machine behind the myth, the book deals, the film rights, the contracts, it's hard to unsee it. It makes you wonder, were they chasing demons? Or just chasing relevance? That doesn't mean that everything they said was false. Maybe some of those families did experience something they couldn't explain. Maybe some of those cases were rooted in real fear, real trauma. But the Warrens didn't just document stories, they shaped them. They repackaged them. They made them marketable. And when you start editing reality for the sake of belief, where does truth actually live? For some, Ed and Lorraine will always be heroes. For others, frauds. But maybe they were both. Maybe they started out with conviction and lost their way. Or maybe they always knew exactly what they were doing. Either way, the question isn't just who they were. It's who we become when we stop asking questions. Because in the end, belief is powerful. But truth is what holds us accountable. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it destroys the version of the story we wanted to believe in. Thank you for walking through this one with me. I know it wasn't easy. But sometimes the darkest histories aren't about ghosts at all. They're about people. Chapter 9: Echoes That Never Really Leave. Sometimes when I finish researching a story like this, I sit back and realize the ghosts aren't always what we expect. They're not just spirits tied to basements or dolls or cursed land. Sometimes they're reputations that refuse to die. Ideas that linger even when the facts have long moved on. That's what Ed and Lorraine Warren became an echo. Their legacy still lives in pop culture, in movies, in documentaries, in late-night YouTube rabbit holes and paranormal forums filled with people desperate to believe in something. And honestly, I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. We all look for meaning, for patterns, for someone to tell us we're not alone when the lights go out and the shadows feel too heavy. But what makes the Warren story hard to fully embrace or fully dismiss is that it walks this uneasy line between belief and exploitation, between faith and performance, between helping people and using their fear as a platform. And that contradiction isn't just about them, it's about us. Because we as a society love a good story. We're drawn to the mysterious, the tragic, the inexplicable. We want to believe that there's more to life than what we see, that evil can be named, that someone somewhere has the answers. And for a long time, Ed and Lorraine Warren offered that. But now that we've seen the shadows behind the spotlight, heard the voices that were silenced, questioned the so-called facts, it's on us to decide what we take away from it all. Do we throw out the entire legacy, call it all a hoax, or do we hold space for complexity, for the possibility that something true may still live beneath the layers of mythology and marketing? Honestly, I don't know the answer. But I do know this: stories like these aren't just about hauntings. They're about power and trust, and how easily we can mistake confidence for truth, especially when that truth is wrapped in religion charisma and a promise that the darkness can be conquered. As we close this chapter, I want to thank you for staying with me through the messy parts, the uncomfortable parts, the parts we don't always want to look at too closely, because that's what True Crime Echoes is really about. Not just the horrors we see in headlines, but the ones that live underneath, quiet, complicated, and very, very human. So wherever you land on Ed and Lorraine Warren, whether you see them as protectors, performers, or something in between, I hope this episode gave you more than just a scare. I hope it made you think. And maybe that's the kind of haunting that matters most. Hey everyone, welcome back to True Crime Echoes. I'm really glad you're here. Today's story is different, not because it's more violent or more twisted than others, but because it forces us to look at something we often take for granted belief. For decades, Ed and Lorraine Warren were considered America's most famous paranormal investigators. Their names are attached to some of the most iconic horror stories of all time: The Conjuring, Annabelle, the Amityville. Horror. You've seen the movies, read the books, heard the legends, but what if behind those ghost stories was something much darker? What if the real horror wasn't in the haunted houses, but in the people who walked through them, recording, collecting, and selling fear to the masses? This episode isn't just about demons or dolls. It's about power, about image, about the fine line between helping people and manipulating them. It's about what happens when we stop asking questions, simply because someone sounds like they know what they're talking about. So whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, I invite you to sit with me in the uncomfortable space between truth and illusion. Because today we're not just revisiting the most chilling cases of the Warrens' career, we're asking what those cases say about them, and what they say about us, about... This is the story of Ed and Lorraine Warren. Let's begin. Thank you for sticking with me through this story. I know it was a heavy one. Haunted houses are one thing, but peeling back the layers of public figures we've been taught to admire, that's something else entirely. I've spent a lot of time thinking about Ed and Lorraine Warren, and the truth is, I still don't know how I feel about them. Maybe they really did believe in what they were doing. Maybe they started with good intentions and lost their way. Or maybe they saw an opportunity and built a myth so convincing even they forgot where the performance ended. But I do know this truth matters, especially in a world that thrives on fear and spectacle. And when we hold people accountable for the whole story, not just the parts they want us to see, we learn how to protect ourselves not just from monsters in the dark, but from those who might sell us a flashlight that doesn't even work. If this episode made you think, or even made you uncomfortable, I encourage you to sit with that feeling. Question it. Talk about it. Share your thoughts in the comments or send me a message. I always want to hear what you think, even if we don't agree. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Echoes. I've got more stories coming, some terrifying, some tragic, all of them real. And if you're into peeling back the curtain on the stories we thought we knew, this is the place to be. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and take care of each other.